Father Michael Harper had not always been a priest. There had been a time when the thought would have sounded absurd, even to him. If someone had told him 15 years earlier that one day he would trade a detective's badge for a black cassock and spend his mornings in prayer instead of interrogation rooms, he would have laughed in their face. Back then, he had belonged to another world, a hard world, a loud world, a world of crime scenes, witness statements, sleepless nights, and the stubborn belief that truth mattered enough to destroy your life for it. Michael had been a homicide detective in a large American city. He had been good at it too. Too good, some people said. Not because he was brilliant in the flashy way television detectives were. He was not the kind of man who kicked open doors or shouted people into confessions. He was patient, careful, quiet. He listened more than he spoke. He noticed what others missed. Most importantly, he was honest. And honesty, he discovered, was not nearly as admired in law enforcement as the public liked to imagine. His fellow officers respected results. His superiors respected convenience. Politicians respected silence. Developers respected money. Donors respected leverage. But honesty? Honesty made people nervous. Honesty made promotions disappear. Honesty made friends stop calling. Still, Michael had believed in it. He had believed in rules, in order, in the possibility that the law could still mean something if enough decent people refused to bend. That belief lasted right up until the case that ruined him. It had started like any other financial crimes investigation. Shell companies, fake permits, missing city funds, bribes moving through contractors and elected offices like dirty water through cracked pipes. At first, it seemed bloodless. Numbers, signatures, closed-door meetings, expensive suits, smiling men shaking hands over stolen futures. He had been warned early. One senior detective told him, very gently, to let it go. A captain he once trusted suggested he take vacation. A man he did not know called him from a blocked number and said, "Everyone has something they care about. In our world, that's money. In your world, it's your family. If we lose ours, you lose yours." Michael remembered exactly where he had been standing when he heard those words. Outside the station, coffee in one hand, file in the other, wind pushing cold air under his collar. He remembered feeling proud. Proud that he had told the man to go to hell. Proud that he had not backed down. Proud that he had gone upstairs afterward and informed his superiors that he finally knew who sat at the center of the scheme. For 3 hours, he felt like the best version of himself. That evening, he learned what pride can cost. He was cleaning out his desk drawer when the call came in. His wife had been shot. So had his little boy. A witness said it happened at a neighborhood playground. Broad daylight. No argument. No robbery. Just a car pulling up, windows rolling down, and bullets crossing a world that had been ordinary seconds earlier. People said many things about what happened next. Some said Michael screamed. Some said he smashed the windshield of his own car with his fist before driving off. He did not remember any of that. What he remembered was movement. Red lights, rain on the road, the impossible sound in his own throat. Then the curve he took too fast. The guardrail. Darkness. He woke in a hospital 3 months later with a broken shoulder, shattered ribs, a scar through his scalp, and nothing left to go home to. His mother-in-law visited once. She stood by the bed, looked at him with a kind of exhausted hatred, and said, "Tell me something. Who needed your honesty? Was it worth my daughter? Was it worth my grandson?" Then she spat on the floor beside his bed and walked out. Michael did not blame her. He blamed himself enough for both of them. He drank after that. For a while, drinking was the only thing he did well. He lost the apartment, lost the job, lost whatever remained of his friends. Some people tried to help. Most gave up. You can only drag a drowning man toward shore for so long before he starts pulling you under with him. He slept in his car, on couches, in abandoned places. In one winter alley behind a grocery store, he truly believed he would freeze before morning, and was disappointed when he didn't. That was where Father Thomas found him, an old parish priest with tired eyes and rough hands. Father Thomas had seen enough broken men to recognize one at a glance. He did not preach. He did not ask questions. He simply said, "Come inside before you die out here and make me do paperwork." Michael had laughed then, a cracked, ugly sound that did not feel like laughter at all. But he followed him. He spent a month in the church rectory. At first, he did nothing but sleep and shake and try not to vomit. Then Father Thomas put an axe in his hands and told him to split wood. The next day, he told him to shovel snow. The next day, he had him clean the chapel steps and repair a storage door, and sort canned food donations in the church pantry. In the evenings, they talked. Not about God at first, about loss, shame, rage. How grief changes shape but never entirely leaves. How there are two ways a man can die, at once or slowly. Father Thomas never told him to forgive. He never told him to understand. He only told him to survive long enough for life to become a question again, instead of a punishment. Somewhere in that winter, Michael stopped wanting to die every hour. A year later, he was still there. 5 years later, he was in seminary. 7 years after the playground, he stood in a small town church in western Pennsylvania, wearing a priest's collar and preparing to preside over the funeral of a young man he had never met. He had been Father Michael for 3 years by then. In the parish, people trusted him because he was the kind of priest who did not hide behind words. If a family needed groceries, he brought them. If a man fell off the wagon and was too ashamed to come to Mass, Father Michael found him under the bridge and brought him soup. If a widow couldn't pay for heating oil, Father Michael somehow made calls until the tank was filled. He believed sermons mattered less than whether you showed up when someone's life came apart at 2 in the morning. That was why people came to him. That was why funerals troubled him so deeply. The dead deserved truth. The living did too. And that morning, standing in the vestry and adjusting the cuffs of his black shirt, he felt trouble before he saw it. "Father, we're ready whenever you are," the funeral home director said softly from the doorway. Michael nodded and stepped toward the sanctuary. That was when a woman in expensive black clothes came quickly down the aisle toward him. She looked to be in her early 40s, maybe younger, but she carried herself with the clipped impatience of someone who never expected to wait for anything. "Can we move this along?" she asked, dabbing at eyes that were red only around the edges, as if grief had been applied like makeup rather than earned. "There are people coming from out of town, and we're already behind." Michael looked at her for a moment. She had introduced herself earlier as the dead young man's stepmother. Her perfume reached him before her sorrow did. He glanced toward the first pews, then back at her. "Funerals are not airline departures," he said mildly. "We begin when we begin." Her mouth tightened. For a second, he saw anger flash beneath the polished mourning. Then she forced a brittle smile. "Of course, Father. I'm just under a lot of stress." "I'm sure you are." She turned away too quickly. Michael watched her cross the sanctuary and slide beside a man in a dark suit who laid a hand possessively at the small of her back. Too familiar. Too comfortable. Not the gesture of a family friend at a funeral. The man did not bow his head, did not look toward the casket. He checked his watch. That was the first thing. The second thing was the girl in the front pew. She could not have been more than 24 or 25. She sat close to the casket, one gloved hand resting on the wood, her face so emptied by grief that she no longer looked fully present in the room. Two friends sat on either side of her, whispering to her, holding tissues she did not seem to notice. Fiancé, Michael guessed. Or maybe almost fiancé. The kind of grief that looks stunned instead of loud is usually the real kind. As the church slowly filled, he moved to the side aisle, standing unnoticed near a column. Years of detective work had never fully left him. Priests hear confessions, detectives hear accidents of truth. It was amazing how much people reveal when they think sorrow makes them invisible. Two young men in the row ahead of him leaned close together and spoke under their breath. "You still think it was her?" one murmured. The other gave a sharp nod. "Come on. Paul dies 2 weeks before the wedding? Right when his father's trust was about to transfer fully to him? You tell me that's coincidence." "Maybe call the cops." "And tell them what? That her boyfriend is the nephew of the police chief? Good luck with that." Michael's spine went cold. The first voice lowered even further. "I heard Paul arguing with Katie on the balcony last week. She was crying, telling him to stop digging into something, to leave it alone. He said once he exposed the truth, he'd finally be able to breathe. The truth about his stepmother. What else?" They fell silent as the organ music began. Michael closed his eyes briefly. It was not his business, he reminded himself. He was not a detective anymore. His task here was to pray for the dead, comfort the grieving, offer the final blessing, and step aside. But some old rooms inside him had already started unlocking. He turned toward the casket. The young man's name, according to the funeral program, was Paul Whitmore. 26 years old, survived by his fiancée, Catherine Cole, survived by his stepmother, Vanessa Whitmore, predeceased by his father, Robert Whitmore. There was no mention of mother, no mention of siblings, no mention of cause of death. Michael took his place before the altar and began. The service moved in the old rhythm: prayer, response, scripture, silence. The familiar language of surrender. But the room would not settle. Vanessa kept glancing at the entrance. Her companion looked irritated rather than grieving. The young fiancée, Katie, seemed to sway where she sat, like someone hanging onto consciousness by a thread. Then, just before the commendation, Katie suddenly stood, as if pulled upright by invisible wires, and collapsed to the floor. People gasped and surged toward her. One of the friends cried out. Vanessa rolled her eyes and snapped far too loudly, "Oh, for God's sake, Katie, stop making a scene!" The words struck the sanctuary walls and came back uglier. Michael crossed the aisle at once and knelt by the fallen girl. Her skin was icy, her breathing too shallow. He looked up at Vanessa. "Please lower your voice," he said. Vanessa's expression hardened. "Then finish this already. How long can a funeral take?" Michael rose slowly. That was when the old warning lifted its head inside him. Not a thought, a sensation. The same sensation he used to get standing over a crime scene when the room was lying. He turned toward the casket again. Something had been bothering him from the moment he entered, though he had not named it. Maybe because a priest has no reason to study a face the way an investigator does. Maybe because he had trained himself for years to stop asking certain kinds of questions. But now he looked. Really looked. The lighting in funeral homes is designed to soften, to conceal, to reassure. Makeup hides what death does to the skin, but no amount of powder changes proportion. No amount of embalming changes structure. And what Michael saw was not grief distorting his perception. It was wrong. Slightly wrong, but wrong all the same. He stepped closer, pretending to adjust the folded hands on Paul Whitmore's chest. Then he saw it. At the edge of the left cheekbone, just near the ear, the skin did not meet cleanly. It lifted by the smallest amount, as if a thin layer had shifted over what lay beneath. Michael's pulse hammered once, hard. A prosthetic. A high-end silicone facepiece, the kind used in professional film work, occasionally in witness protection operations, and once, many years ago, in a federal fraud case he had worked before his life had exploded. Nobody around him noticed, but Michael knew. He had seen enough lies to recognize one. He felt every eye in the room on his back without turning to confirm it. The funeral director shifted nervously near the side wall. Katie had pushed herself halfway upright, held now by her friends, staring at him with the desperate, impossible hope of a woman who wanted the world to reverse itself. Vanessa's voice cracked across the church again. "What are you doing?" Michael reached down. For one suspended second, every version of his life seemed to exist at once. The detective, the drunk, the survivor, the priest. Then he took hold of the loosened edge and pulled. The face came away cleanly. A scream tore through the room. The body in the casket was not Paul Whitmore. It was another man entirely, older, rougher, gaunt in a way expensive death makeup could not erase. A man from the margins. A man no wealthy family would have mistaken for their golden heir unless they expected no one to look too closely. The church erupted. People lurched backward. Someone shouted for police. Vanessa spun toward the doors, dragging her lover with her. Michael opened his mouth to shout for them to be stopped, but before he could, the front doors of the church burst open. Sunlight flooded the aisle, and in that hard white beam stood a young man with a bandaged temple, pale but very much alive. Paul Whitmore. Behind him came 3 men in plain clothes, wearing badges at their belts. Paul's voice rang through the church, sharp and steady. "Going somewhere, Vanessa?" The room froze. Katie made a sound that was half sob, half prayer. Paul looked at the woman who had tried to bury another man in his place and said, "I'm sorry you won't make it to the reading of my father's final trust documents. You were supposed to wait just 2 more weeks. Guess patience never was your strong suit." Vanessa's companion let go of her instantly. "I didn't know any of this," he said, backing away with both hands up. "She told me he'd run off, that the funeral was for appearances." Vanessa stared at him with open hatred. "You spineless bastard." Then she lunged at him, nails out, no longer caring who saw. The plainclothes officers moved in fast and separated them. Katie staggered down the aisle like she had forgotten how to walk. When she reached Paul, she clung to him so violently, Michael thought they might both fall. "I thought you were dead," she whispered against his chest. "I know," Paul said, holding her. "I know. I'm sorry. I had to leave town fast. I thought local police were compromised. I never imagined they'd fake the funeral." Michael stepped back and exhaled for what felt like the first time in 10 minutes. The funeral director, white as paper, muttered, What do we do now?" Paul, still holding Katie, turned and looked at the casket. The dead stranger, the borrowed body, the full room of witnesses. He swallowed. "That man deserves a real burial," he said. "My family paid for everything. Keep the arrangements, just remove my name." The funeral director nodded several times in quick succession, relieved to have any practical instruction at all. The officers led Vanessa and her lover out through the side door. The church slowly began to breathe again, and Michael stood in the center of it all, feeling something he had not felt in years. Not peace. Not exactly. Purpose. Because for the second time in his life, he had stood in the path between a lie and the truth. And for the second time, it had cost him the life he was currently living. He knew it before he admitted it. He could not go back to saying prayers over injustice while pretending the world was not asking him for more than that. He finished the day. He helped oversee the burial of the unknown man. He stayed with the funeral staff until sunset. He sat alone in the rectory kitchen long after dark. By morning, he had made his choice. This would be his last week as Father Michael Harper. Father Michael Harper had buried many people, but this was the first time he buried a stranger under another man's name, then crossed that name out and stood in silence while the coffin was lowered into the ground. The man they buried had no family present, No photographs. No stories. Just a cheap suit provided by the funeral home and a grave marker that said, "Unknown Male." Michael stayed until everyone left. Paul and Katie had gone hours earlier with the federal agents. The stepmother and her lover had been taken in separate cars. The town was already boiling with rumors. By tomorrow, everyone would have a different version of what happened in the church. But Michael stood there until the last shovel of dirt was smoothed flat. "Everyone deserves a real ending," he said quietly to the fresh soil. That night he did not sleep. He sat at the small kitchen table in the rectory, hands around a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. On the wall hung a wooden cross. On the chair beside him lay his priest's collar. For 7 years he had tried to live a different life. A quiet life. A life where he helped people one at a time, instead of fighting monsters he could never fully defeat. But some battles, he realized, do not end just because you walk away from them. Sometimes they wait. And sometimes they come looking for you in a church, inside a coffin, wearing another man's face. At 6 in the morning, there was a knock on the door. Michael already knew who it was. When he opened it, Paul Whitmore stood on the steps with Katie beside him. Paul looked exhausted, pale and thinner than he had the day before. The bandage around his head had been replaced, clean and white. Katie looked like she had not let go of his hand all night. Behind them stood another man in a dark coat. Michael recognized him immediately. "Daniel Reyes," Michael said slowly. The man nodded once. "You were my training officer 15 years ago. Homicide." Michael stepped aside and let them in. They sat at the table. No one touched the coffee Michael poured. For a while, nobody spoke. Then Paul said, "They tried to kill me." Michael leaned back slightly in his chair. "Start at the beginning." Paul nodded. He spoke calmly, but his fingers never stopped moving, like a man still wired for danger. "My father built Whitmore Logistics from nothing," Paul said. "Trucking, shipping, warehousing. By the time he died, it was worth hundreds of millions. But the company structure was complicated. My stepmother inherited part of it, but the controlling shares were locked in a trust. I got full control only after I got married or turned 30. "How old are you?" Michael asked. 26. "So she had 4 more years of control," Michael said. Paul nodded. "Unless I got married." Katie squeezed his hand. Michael understood immediately. "So if you married, she lost everything." "Not everything," Paul said, "but control. And control is everything when you're moving money the way she was moving it." Michael's eyes sharpened. She was stealing from the company. "Worse," Daniel Reyes said quietly. "Money laundering. Fake transport routes. Ghost shipments. Someone was using Whitmore trucks to move things that weren't on paper." Michael felt the old world sliding back into place around him like a suit he had once worn every day. "Drugs?" he asked. Daniel shook his head. "Sometimes. Mostly weapons. Unregistered. Moving across state lines inside legitimate cargo." Michael looked at Paul. "And you found out?" Paul nodded. "My father suspected something before he died. That's why he changed the will. He told me to get married as soon as possible, said I'd understand later. I didn't. Not until I started digging through company records myself. And when your stepmother realized you knew, Michael said slowly, you became a problem. Paul gave a humorless smile. A very expensive problem. Katie spoke for the first time. He wanted to go to the police. I begged him not to. I was scared. People like that don't go to prison quietly. Michael looked at her. You were right. Paul continued. 2 weeks ago, I was driving back from a meeting when a truck ran me off the road. I woke up later in a private clinic outside the city. Daniel was there. Michael looked at Reyes. We got a call from a federal informant, Reyes said. Said a wealthy heir was about to have a very convincing funeral. We moved fast, got Paul out before anyone knew he was alive. And the body? Michael asked. Reyes' face hardened. Unidentified male, probably a homeless man, dead from overdose. They used him because no one would come looking. Michael closed his eyes for a moment. The world had not changed as much as he had hoped. Paul leaned forward slightly. We needed the funeral to happen. We needed Vanessa to show up. Needed her to believe I was dead so she'd start moving money, contacting people, making mistakes. And she did, Reyes said. Phones started ringing the moment the service began. We have recordings. Warrants are already in motion. Michael looked at them both. So why are you here? He asked. Paul and Reyes exchanged a glance. Then Reyes said, because this town's police department is dirty. Not all of them, but enough. We're going to clean it out, and we need someone to run it afterward. Michael almost laughed. I'm a priest, he said. Reyes shook his head slightly. You were one of the best detectives I ever saw. You walked away because the job destroyed your life. I get that. But the men who destroyed your life? They're the same kind of men we're talking about right now. Silence filled the kitchen. Katie looked at Michael carefully. Paul told me what happened to your family. Michael did not answer. She swallowed. If men like Vanessa don't get stopped, they just keep going. They don't stop on their own. Paul added quietly, you stopped one yesterday. You didn't have to. You could have just finished the funeral and walked away. But you didn't. Michael looked down at his hands. He remembered another day, another case, another time he had chosen to keep digging instead of backing down. He remembered the phone call. He remembered the playground. He remembered the hospital room. He remembered the question, was it worth it? For years, he had believed the answer was no. Now he wasn't so sure. Reyes reached into his coat and placed a folder on the table. Internal Affairs is going to dismantle half the department, he said. We need a new chief who isn't owned by anyone. Someone who knows what corruption looks like. Someone who's already lost everything and therefore can't be threatened. Michael looked at the folder but did not touch it. I buried my family because I didn't know when to stop, he said quietly. Reyes shook his head. No. You buried your family because criminals were allowed to become untouchable. That wasn't your fault. That was the system's fault. And now you have a chance to fix part of that system. Michael stared at the folder for a long time. Then he stood up and walked to the wall. He took the priest's collar from the chair, held it in his hands. For 7 years, this had been his way to survive, his way to live with grief, his way to help people without fighting wars he couldn't win. But maybe he had been wrong about one thing. Maybe some wars are not meant to be won. Maybe They are meant to be fought anyway. He turned back to the table. "When do I start?" he asked. Paul exhaled slowly, like a man who had been holding his breath for weeks. Reyes allowed himself a small smile. And Katie, watching the man who had pulled a mask off a corpse and changed all of their lives, realized something in that moment. Some people don't get a peaceful life. Some people get a meaningful one. And sometimes those are not the same thing. Michael Harper did not return to the police department the way most men return to work. There was no welcome party, no speeches, no smiles. The building looked exactly the same as it had 15 years earlier. The same grey walls, the same flickering fluorescent lights, the same smell of old coffee, paper, and problems nobody wanted to solve. But the people inside had changed. Or rather, some of them hadn't changed at all. That was the problem. Internal affairs and federal agents had already started tearing the department apart from the inside. Offices were being searched, computers seized, lockers opened. 2 captains were suspended. 1 lieutenant had taken early retirement at 6 in the morning with a lawyer present. 3 officers called in sick and never came back. Corruption does not leave quietly. It leaks. It lies. It deletes files. It makes phone calls at night. Michael walked through the corridor while conversations died around him. Some men recognized him. A few nodded with respect. Others looked away. 1 or 2 looked at him the way people look at a man who brings storms with him. Reyes met him near the captain's office. "Not too late to change your mind," Reyes said. Michael looked through the glass wall into the office that used to belong to a man now under federal investigation. "When I change my mind," Michael said, "I'll let you know." Reyes handed him a folder. "Start with this. Whitmore case. Everything we have so far." Michael sat at the desk and opened the file. Photos, bank transfers, shipping routes, warehouse numbers, names. So many names. Vanessa Whitmore was not working alone. She was part of something larger. A network that moved illegal weapons using legitimate trucking routes. Paperwork was altered. Containers were swapped. Drivers were paid to ask no questions. Police escorts were sometimes arranged for the important shipments. Michael flipped another page. 2 names made his hand stop. He read them again slowly. Captain Harold Green. Councilman Daniel Price. He leaned back in the chair and closed the folder. "They're not just moving weapons," Michael said quietly when Reyes returned. "They're buying protection." Reyes nodded. "That's why this is bigger than one arrest. If we pull one thread, the whole city starts to unravel." Michael looked around the office. "This is going to get ugly." Reyes gave a dry smile. "It already is." The first arrest. Vanessa Whitmore was arrested 2 days later. She walked out of her house in a white coat and sunglasses as if she were leaving for lunch, not being taken into federal custody. Cameras were already waiting. Someone had tipped off the press. She did not resist. She did not cry. She only said 1 sentence before getting into the car. "You have no idea how many important people you're about to embarrass." Michael watched the arrest on a small TV in his office. Reyes stood in the doorway. "She's not wrong," Reyes said. Michael nodded slowly. "People like her never sit at the top. They sit in the middle. high enough to have power, low enough to take the fall. Reyes crossed his arms. You think she talks? Michael looked at the screen where Vanessa Whitmore disappeared into the police vehicle. No, he said. I think she waits. 3 nights later, Michael was working late. The department was quieter now. Half the building felt empty. Files were being reopened, old cases re-examined. Officers who used to walk like kings now walked like men trying to remember what they had said to whom. Michael left the building a little after midnight. The parking lot was mostly empty. One streetlight flickered above his car. He noticed the van too late. The side door slid open. The first shot shattered his car window. Michael dropped instantly and rolled behind the engine block as 2 more shots punched into the metal where his chest had been a second earlier. The world became noise and broken glass and adrenaline. He drew his weapon and fired once toward the van's tires. The shooter ducked back inside. The van door slammed. Tires screamed. The vehicle disappeared into the night before backup could arrive. Reyes arrived 5 minutes later to find Michael sitting on the curb, breathing hard, glass in his hair, coat torn at the shoulder where a bullet had grazed him. You okay? Reyes asked. Michael nodded once. Yeah. Reyes looked at the shattered car. That was fast. Michael stared at the empty street where the van had disappeared. Yeah, he said quietly. That means we're close. The next morning, Michael found an envelope on his desk. No stamp, no address, just his name written in black ink. Inside was a single sheet of paper. You already lost one family. Don't make the same mistake twice. Walk away. Michael stared at the note for a long time. Then he folded it once and put it in his pocket. Reyes saw his face and knew immediately something had happened. They threatened you, Reyes said. Michael nodded. Reyes waited. Michael said nothing for a while, then finally spoke. 15 years ago, I got a call like this, he said. They told me everyone has something they care about. They were right. Reyes leaned against the desk. So what are you going to do? Michael looked out the window. Last time I chose the law, he said. And I lost everything. Reyes didn't interrupt. Michael continued quietly. This time, I'm not choosing the law. And I'm not choosing revenge either. He turned back to Reyes. This time, I'm choosing the people who can't protect themselves from people like this. Reyes studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded once. Good, he said. Because this is bigger than both of us now. The truth comes out. A week later, the first major break came from Vanessa Whitmore herself. Not a confession, a deal. She agreed to testify, but only if she received protection and a reduced sentence. The courtroom was silent when she finally spoke. She named businessmen. She named politicians. She named police officers. She named a judge. But then she said a name Michael did not expect. She said the name of the man who had ordered the hit on Paul Whitmore, and the name of the man who had ordered the hit on Michael Harper's family 15 years ago. It was the same man, Councilman Daniel Price. The room exploded in noise. Reyes turned slowly toward Michael. Michael did not move. For 15 years he had lived with ghosts. Now one of them had a name. Part 3. That night, Michael stood alone in the church where everything had started. He walked down the aisle slowly and stood in front of the altar. "I didn't want this life," he said quietly into the empty church. "But I understand now. Some people don't get to choose a quiet life. They get chosen for a hard one." He looked at the cross. Then he said one more sentence. "Just give me enough time to finish this." The church was silent, but for the first time in many years, Michael Harper felt something that was stronger than grief. He felt direction. And the war was just beginning. The trial of Councilman Daniel Price became the biggest news story in the state. Television trucks lined the street outside the courthouse every morning. Reporters spoke in urgent voices about corruption, weapons trafficking, and political scandal. Commentators argued about how long the network had existed, how deep it went, and how many careers would end before it was over. But for Michael Harper, it was never about politics. It was about a phone call 15 years ago. It was about a playground. It was about a small boy who never got to grow up. And now, for the first time, the man responsible was sitting in a courtroom 10 meters away. Daniel Price did not look like a monster. That was the problem. He looked like what he was. A successful American politician. Grey suit, perfect haircut, calm expression. The face of a man who had shaken thousands of hands and promised thousands of things he never intended to give. Men like him did not pull triggers. They made phone calls. They signed papers. They made problems disappear. And for years, he had believed he would never sit in a defendant's chair. Vanessa Whitmore testified for 6 hours. She spoke clearly, without emotion, like a businesswoman presenting quarterly results. She explained how the company trucks moved illegal cargo, how police escorts were arranged, how money was distributed, which officers were paid, which officials were blackmailed, which judges were convinced. Then the prosecutor asked the final question. Who ordered the murder of Robert Whitmore's son? Vanessa folded her hands. Daniel Price, she said. The courtroom filled with noise. The judge shouted for order. The prosecutor continued. And do you know who ordered the murder of Detective Michael Harper's family 15 years ago? Vanessa turned her head slightly and looked directly at Michael. Yes, she said. It was the same man. For a moment, Michael could not hear anything. 15 years of pain became very quiet inside him. Not gone, just quiet. Daniel Price's lawyer stood up immediately, objecting, attacking her credibility, calling her a criminal trying to save herself. But it was too late. The jury had heard. And more importantly, the federal records, bank transfers, phone logs, and witnesses all told the same story. Vanessa Whitmore's testimony was not the only evidence. It was just the final piece. The parking garage. The trial lasted 3 weeks. On the 22nd day, Michael left the courthouse late in the evening and walked into the underground parking garage. He knew something was wrong the moment he stepped between the concrete pillars. Too quiet. Too empty. He stopped walking. A voice behind him said, "You should have walked away when you had the chance." Michael turned slowly. Daniel Price stood 10 meters away near a black sedan. He was alone. No lawyers. No police. Just the two of them in the grey concrete silence. "You're out on bail," Michael said calmly. Price smiled slightly. "For another 48 hours. He took a few steps closer. "You destroyed a lot of important people, Detective," Price said. "Do you know how many careers ended because of you? How many men lost everything?" Michael looked at him without expression. "I know exactly how that feels," Michael said. Price tilted his head. "I didn't order your family killed because of the case," he said. "I ordered it because you wouldn't stop. There's a difference. You were a message." Michael's hands did not move. For years he had imagined this moment. In his imagination, he always attacked. In reality, he just stood there. Price studied his face. "I expected more anger," Price said. Michael answered quietly, "I had 15 years to be angry." Price nodded slowly, almost respectfully. Then he said, "If it makes you feel better, I do regret one thing." Michael waited. "I regret that it didn't work," Price said. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then Michael said something Price did not expect. "You're not important enough for my revenge," Michael said. Price frowned slightly. Michael continued, "But you are important enough for justice." At that exact moment, car doors opened behind the pillars and federal agents stepped out of the shadows. Price looked around once, realized immediately what had happened, and gave a small, tired smile. "You planned this," he said. Michael shook his head. "No, you did. Men like you always need the last word." The agents put Daniel Price in handcuffs and led him away. Price did not resist. As he passed Michael, he said quietly, "You think this changes anything? There will always be another man like me." Michael answered, "I know." Price smiled slightly. "Then what's the point?" Michael looked at him and said the words that would stay with him for the rest of his life. "The point is that sometimes you lose." The verdict. Daniel Price was sentenced to life in federal prison. Vanessa Whitmore received 20 years. Several police officers went to prison. 2 politicians resigned before charges were filed. 3 companies were shut down. The network was destroyed. Not forever, but for now. And sometimes for now is the only victory that exists. The final scene. A month later, Michael stood in a small church again. But this time it was not a funeral. It was a wedding. Paul Whitmore and Katie stood in front of the altar, holding hands, looking like 2 people who had almost lost everything, and therefore understood exactly what they had. Michael stood in front of them in a black suit, not a priest's robe. He was no longer Father Harper. He was Chief Harper now. But Paul had asked him one thing. "Even if you're not a priest anymore, will you still bless our marriage?" Michael had thought about it for a long time. Then he said yes. Now he looked at them and said, "Life doesn't give many second chances. When it does, you don't waste them." Katie was crying. Paul was smiling. And Michael realized something in that moment. 15 years ago, he lost his family, but he did not lose his life. He did not lose his purpose, and he did not lose the ability to stand between good people and bad ones. Some men get peace. Some men get war. And sometimes, if they are lucky, they get to choose what they fight for. Michael Harper looked at the two people in front of him and said, "Take care of each other. That's the only thing in this world that really matters." Outside the church, the sun was shining. And for the first time in many years, Michael walked out not as a broken man, not as a priest, not as a detective, but as a man who finally understood why he had survived.